My name's Mark Hepworth. I'm a professor in People's Information Behaviour and very actively involved in the Aura project. We've just heard from 3 speakers about their perceptions of research and the kinds of research they're doing and how things have changed to some extent over time and some of the implications of that for how we practice research. What we'd like to do now is just expand on that a little bit and unpick some of the common issues that seem to pop up in the previous talks. Okay, so to pursue that theme, one of the things that kept coming through to me, or to my ears at least, was this notion of complexity. Why is that, on the stage? Why haven't things always been complex?
I could start with a few thoughts. I think we could think about complexity in 2 ways. One is kind of how complex the issues are, all the forces and dynamics of society, environment, economics, politics, and change, and how those are all interacting in ways that feel to us to becoming increasingly complex in the sense that they're crashing in on each other and impinging on each other and so on. But I think there's another kind of complexity which has to do with multiple perceptions, multiple perspectives, that different people in a system are going to have very different ways of seeing the world, understanding the world, and acting within the world. And one can't assume a shared understanding or a shared conceptualization of that complex reality, because different actors will be working from different positions and places within that. So one of the tasks of research is not only to understand all the forces and drivers, but also the different perspectives on them. And that has big implications for the approach. How is it that one can appreciate and draw out those different perspectives?
Let's say another reason why people have become interested in complexity in the health sector. And that is, a number of years ago, it was seen that there were a few policy options that needed to be implemented, and if they were, health services would improve and they would meet the needs of people. And a number of studies in the past few years have found that the design of a policy was much less important than the process of implementation. And so increasingly in the health sector, there's also an interest in what's called implementation research, which is that how do we take a good idea and then use it to change how, in this case, a health system is functioning. And as people have thought about that, it's become clear there is not a straight connection between a policy and a good outcome. And so it's led to people understanding that there are many things happen you didn't expect, many good things happen you didn't expect and you need to build on, and many unintended bad things emerge. And so there's now much more of a sense that we need to understand the context within which we're managing change, and that has led to an interest in complexity.
If you were to extend that in the thought about implementation, then I think things have become more complex as well. Governments are dealing with larger populations in more concentrated spaces. Cities are becoming largely unmanageable given the sort of growth that's happening within them. And I think the expectations of the state have changed as well. I mean, the idea that the state really should be providing for everybody, that it's got to be playing a role, that citizens now expect certain services. I think there's been a sea shift in that in the last 30 years as well, with democratization, and the relationship between the state and citizen is certainly is different now. So it's put pressures on policy that are fairly complex.
And it seems to have led to an appreciation or an acceptance, and that's a bit of a question mark, of learning takes place en route to some extent, which is potentially a bit uncomfortable. Maybe that's uncomfortable for funders, maybe it's uncomfortable for participants, maybe it's uncomfortable for academics in terms of how they publish. I'm not sure, but this process, you seem to be saying, or you seem to be implying, or what I'm hearing, is that the emphasis on learning while one is actually implementing or conducting some research or beginning research. But does that cause tension? Shandana?
I think I think it's made people move out of their comfort zones, and that creates all kinds of pressures. We have in the sort of trainings that we do, we hear all the time the line, but this is not what I usually do, and this is not where I come at this from. This is not how I'm trained. And the fact that we're essentially saying, well, forget about all of that, right, and try something new, or collaborate with somebody else who have a different way of answering that, I think is really shaking up people out and moving them out of their comfort zones, which is a difficult process.
Yeah.
But also this idea that their own method or approach may not be very complete, or that we're looking for more complete answers.
Quite challenging.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And
critical.
yeah.
But I might turn that on its head and actually draw attention. There was a really very good special issue of The Lancet in a year or two ago on what they call the Bangladesh paradox, which was why in a country where there are many problems with the public system and many issues of governance, etc., why could Bangladesh achieve much better health outcomes than other countries in South Asia? And this was written by people who had been involved for many years in the reform process. And their conclusion was the capacity to innovate, the capacity to learn from small-scale innovations and take them to scale was a key element. And so although this is coming from the research community, these learning approaches are becoming more and more embedded in how large organizations function. And I guess the other example I could have brought, which I mentioned, is the Chinese government in implementing a very rapid reform. The whole process involved local learning and then taking lessons from local learning to scale. So these are processes that are way beyond the research community.
Yes, and I think where the tensions come in that Mark is talking about, where there's a need for these learning process approaches in the way policy is reformed and practice is developed, the funding environment is often working against that because it has predetermined results that need to be achieved and designs that need to be submitted. And so I think the challenge at the funding end is to come up with more flexible framework kinds of approaches that are that allow for that kind of emergent action learning or implementation research approach to, and that I think it also shifts the role of research from being something that kind of comes at the end of a 3 or 5 year project, makes a summative assessment about what worked and didn't work, and sort of feeds back into the next blueprint. I think that's, there's a role for that, but I think the kind of research that both Shandana and Jerry are talking about is one that's much more about an accompaniment, a process approach, and where practice can evolve through a learning process. And research needs to adapt itself to be able to play that role, walking alongside these processes. And in turn, funders need to adapt themselves to allow for those sorts of processes, rather than demanding prescribed results at the beginning.
And government officials or other innovators also need to adapt how they work with researchers.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, and that kind of learning approach, maybe it's stimulated by ideas about evidence and how evidence is gathered gradually. Maybe it's connected with notions of evidential impact as well. I mean, to some extent, I mean, for me it sounds like research grown up You know, I mean, I know it sounds a bit trite, but it seems like research coming of age in a way of, you know, appreciating reality of connecting research with real world problems and trying to make a difference. Is that a bit too strong to say?
I mean, it's partly researchers coming of age, and it's also people who are implementing change, understanding that they can't take forward big reforms without having evidence. And so it's a mutual partnership that becomes the key. And when one thinks of Africa, which probably is embarking on a process of rather rapid change now, it's researchers seeing themselves as having an important role in this change process, and understanding that tomorrow's Africa will be very different to yesterday's, and how can researchers be looking forward at what's coming rather than back. So yes, I think it's part of seeing that when big changes happen, researchers have to come of age.
Yeah, and be part of a journey, a participative journey in a sense.
I think it's a really exciting time in that sense, is that I think research and policy have come very close together at this point. And you're absolutely right, Jerry, about researchers in Africa that we deal with. They're all asking policy relevant questions, and then going beyond it. It's not just that it's policy relevant, but they're asking questions that are on the policy agenda and that are being actively debated, and they are interested in contributing. So a lot of the questions that we get is very much about wanting to be relevant to questions that matter and trying to provide answers that they know people are looking for. I don't know the history of this enough to know how much that has changed, but that's certainly the point that we're at right now, is that policy and research are
I think there's perhaps an expectation now that research shouldn't just be a sort of definitive moment in a big policy cycle where you suddenly get the evidence on what was working and do something different going forward. I mean, there are moments like that, of course, that are important, but I think you're describing something that is much more of a process in which the research goes alongside implementation or practice, and in which there's possibility for it to feed into what people are doing rather than sort of feeding up to a policy level and going back down through some sort of line management. And I think that's why you're beginning to see research design incorporate questions of learning, uptake, and communication right from the beginning, rather than the bolt-on at the end that is somehow supposed to inform a policymaker somewhere in the stratosphere. It's about learning for all of those who are implicated in the research, and that being built in from the beginning in the design and approach. But you know, this is all work in progress. I don't think we're there yet.
Well, but since, you know, because I know a lot of this discussion is about people in Africa, I mean, countries are embarking on extremely rapid urbanization, very big changes in their economy, very big changes in their infrastructure, very big changes in mobile technology and access of almost every citizen to a mobile phone. All very big expectations now of the public of having health services that meet their needs. And governments that in several countries have already made commitments to national insurance strategies, which we all know are high benefit but high risk. And so researchers now have important roles to play in enabling this change process to avoid some of the worst mistakes and to invent the new models for the 21st century. So it's not just researchers thinking differently, but the development possibilities are opening up in ways that research has to contribute if people are to avoid big mistakes.
And perhaps, you know, the state of affairs in a sense, people appreciate the criticality of the situation in a way, in a global context that perhaps maybe has been apparent but has not been taken on board to that extent, and maybe that is one of the drivers. Obviously, I think it's beyond this conversation now, but will certainly be the outcome of the regional event, is to think, what implications this has for researchers themselves and the training of researchers and their capacity. You've mentioned, for example, the understanding of context, the use of social media, Twitter and various things like that. You've mentioned also the need to network and create these networks, etc., etc. These are skills in the past that researchers didn't place that much emphasis on, to some extent. So just to turn the attention a little bit towards the implications for us as helping to develop future researchers. What comments would you make in terms of this shifting perspective, this slightly new way of perhaps approaching research and so on, and the relationships with wider stakeholders? What comments would you like to make with regard to that?
Well, if I were a young researcher listening to this, I would have found this very intimidating. We have to have all the classical skills and many new skills. And I think that's a challenge for young researchers, but it also poses questions for the leadership of research institutes and the departments they work in. How can we get people with these multiple skills to work together to be effective? So I think it's important to look at the individual capacities, but also at the institute level leadership.
Thank you.
Just to add very quickly to that, it's a very similar thought in working with researchers who work in African universities. We sort of realize that there are continuing I don't know, but challenges in terms of openness to new methods. So there's I'm wondering how to sort of put this, but there seems to be institutional rules and regulations that stop a lot of openness, a lot of experimentation, a lot of taking on new ideas.
Sure.
In some cases, a hypothesis that you've submitted years before when you started your research is something you're expected to hold yourself to at the end of your research, just because the university regulation works like that. So it's one thing to ask researchers to be more open, but I think Jerry's absolutely right in saying that the institutions have regulations that need to change in accordance with that as well. And I think a lot of discussion with people in those positions would be a very good way to go about it.
Yes, and perhaps just to return to the theme of research communication and uptake, I think there are all sorts of opportunities for innovation if that space is made available for people to engage in using video, photography, all sorts of storytelling, other kinds of data visualization. There's so many ways that researchers are now expected to be communicating as they go along. This isn't just about what you do at the end, but the continual communication, including back to the people who are the subjects of the research, so that they can be part of the change process that is coming through the learning, and not only expecting the sort of formal report at the end to somehow affect their lives. And I think that's an expectation on researchers to be more engaged, to communicate in different ways with multimedia. And it sounds intimidating perhaps, but I think people are very innovative, and these technologies can be quite powerful and empowering for those who use them. And I think there are opportunities for new generations of researchers to do things very differently from the way they've been done in the past. And it's an open field for people to experiment with, and with huge possibility.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. Yes, I think it is a huge opportunity. It's I would say it's a fun opportunity in a way. For me, research is like Christmas. To be able to do work where you are actually paid to find things out. Well, fantastic. So, and I think the young people are in a better place in a sense. And I think that's challenged. With the leadership, they are in a way in a better place, more adept at these various technologies that more familiar. So I think the conversation will continue, and thank you very much for your input.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.